A smile masked an invitation to death. Welcome to Detectory. I am your host, Shadow. Comment your country below. Your presence means everything. Let's dive in. Little Fordington liked to think of itself as the sort of English village where disasters arrived only after proper notice. Even the postman always delivered calamity with a courteous cough and a nod. Even quarrels came politely, a pointed letter about church flowers, a resigned sigh over hedges cut an inch too high. And on the first Saturday of May, when lilacs spilled over brick walls, the village gathered on the rectory lawn for the spring charity fete. The marquee sat like a plump white cloud. Jam tarts shone like rubies. Sandwiches marched in disciplined ranks. Jane Marple took a wicker chair at the edge of things, her knitting in her lap, as unobtrusive as a potted fern. She had helped set out plates. Now she listened with mild eyes while her needles clicked and her mind collected scraps. Near the roses, Reverend Caleb Hartley smiled bravely at every well-wisher. Miss Marple saw that his smile was the sort a man wore when he had priced a roof repair and found the collection plate wanting. Beside him, Mrs. Hartley directed volunteers with the briskness of an admiral. "Do put the lemon drizzle nearer the front, Maud," she called. Across the lawn, Dr. Beatrice Sloane held court with the practiced ease of someone who enjoyed being listened to. Her dark hair was pinned neat, through her laugh a little too bright. "Men never notice the obvious," she said, and the small circle tittered obligingly. The obvious, at that moment, was the arrival of Lionel Bicker. He drove up in a polished motor car. Lionel had been born in Little Fordington, left it noisily at 18, and returned quietly at 38, with money and a suit that fit like a promise. His mother, Mrs. Bicker, hurried toward him, her face arranged in delighted reproach. "You're late," she said. I'm fashionable," Lionel replied, kissing her cheek. His smile was charming, almost lazy. Miss Marple noticed, as she often did, that smiles were not always invitations to trust. Sometimes they were coverlets pulled neatly over something untidy. Lionel moved among the guests with an ease that suggested larger rooms than a rectory lawn. He complimented Mrs. Hartley's flowers, asked after the vicar's health, and paused at Miss Marple's chair as though he had made a point of remembering old faces. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" he said. "My mother tells me you're the village's conscience." "Oh, I hope not," Miss Marple said gently. "Consciences can be terribly inconvenient." He laughed, and for a moment his eyes sharpened. "Then, your wisdom," he corrected, lowering his voice. "Have you met Mr. Dorian Pike?" Miss Marple had not, though she had seen the man, tall, sandy-haired, with the attentive look of someone trained to listen for trouble. Mr. Pike stood near the drinks table, speaking to Mrs. de Winthrop of the manor house, whose disapproval could curdle milk. "That's him," Lionel murmured, "renting the old gatehouse. Works in London, they say. Quiet fellow." Miss Marple knit a row of plain stitches. Quiet fellows, she thought, were often quiet because they were listening. The afternoon warmed. Cups clinked, laughter rose and fell, and for a while, Little Fordington became precisely what it liked to imagine. Safe, decent, faintly superior. Then Miss Marple saw Lionel cross toward Miss Winthrop carrying a small cream envelope, the sort used for notes that mattered. Mrs. Winthrop's chin lifted. Lionel's smile broadened. Pleasant, open, perfectly placed. He offered the envelope as if it were a compliment. From her chair, Miss Marple saw Mrs. Winthrop's gloved fingers tighten at the edges. The smile on Lionel's face never altered, yet something in the angle of his wrist suggested urgency, as though he were making certain she could not refuse. Mrs. Winthrop glanced down. Her eyes flicked over the card inside. For a heartbeat, her expression slipped, only a fraction, like a mask shifting. Then it returned, composed and chilly. "How thoughtful," she said, loudly enough for others to hear. "A most kind invitation." I do hope you'll come, Lionel said. Dr. Sloane drifted nearer, drawn by the faint scent of tension. Invitation to what? She asked, smiling. Merely a little gathering, Mrs. Winthrop replied, sliding the card back into the envelope. Nothing of consequence. Lionel's gaze darted from Mrs. Winthrop to Dr. Sloane and back. Oh, I think it may be of consequence, he said softly, then raised his voice. But not today. Today we celebrate spring. Miss Marple watched him walk away. The charm of his smile lingered, and yet she felt, because she had watched small cruelties in small places all her life, that the envelope had not carried a party invitation at all. It had carried something that belonged to endings, a funeral invitation, and perhaps hidden behind a smile. A teacup shattered on the far side of the lawn. Conversation snapped off. A woman cried out, thin, sharp, shocked. Mrs. Bicker stood rigid beside the trestle table, one hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes fixed on the grass beyond the hedge. "Lionel," she whispered. "Oh, Lionel, no." Beyond the neatly clipped privet, half hidden among the bluebells edging the path to the churchyard, a man lay very still, his face turned toward the sky, as if he were smiling at something only he could see. The cry drew the village as surely as the bell drew them on Sundays. Chairs scraped, skirts rustled, men hurried with an air of reluctant authority. Miss Marple rose more slowly, not from lack of concern, but from habit. One saw better from the edges. Reverend Hartley was first through the gap in the hedge, his shoes sinking into damp earth. Dr. Sloane followed, already stripping off her gloves. Lionel Bicker appeared at a run, a face pale beneath the geniality he had worn like a tie. Mr. Dorian Pike was there too, unexpectedly swift. The man among the bluebells was not a villager. Miss Marple noted that at once. His clothes were good but dusty, his boots city-made, and one cuff bore a faint smear of something dark. His mouth was slightly open. Dr. Sloane knelt, fingers at the neck. "Dead," she said crisply, "and not for long. Perhaps 15 minutes. She leaned closer. "There's a mark beneath the jaw." Lionel bent over, swallowing. "Who is he?" Mrs. Winthrop made a small sound. "That is, good heavens, that is Mr. Felix Grange." "The solicitor," someone gasped. Mrs. Winthrop's eyes flicked toward Lionel, then away. "Yes, from Market Belling. He handled certain matters." Reverend Hartley stared as if the bluebells had turned to snakes. But why would he be here? He wasn't expected. At the edge of the cluster, Miss Marple saw Mrs. and Bicker clutching Maud's arm so hard the girl's fingers whitened. "Lionel, you said—" Mrs. Bicker began, and stopped. Mr. Pike's voice carried. "Send for the police, and keep people back. Don't trample the ground." Dr. Sloane stood, brushing her skirt. "Caleb, fetch Sergeant Weller. I'll telephone the station." They formed a ragged semicircle, the living staring at the dead. Miss Marple's gaze moved, not to the face, but to the surroundings. Bluebells crushed under feet, already too many. Not a broken twig on the hedge, a faint scuff in the soil, and, on the path, something pale against the dark earth. While others murmured, Miss Marple stooped as if her stocking had slipped. Her fingers closed over a small rectangle of card, slightly damp. She did not read it. She merely slipped it into her knitting bag with the same unhurried motion with which she might have pocketed a dropped button. Lionel's voice rose, strained. "This is ridiculous. A man dies in our hedge at a fete. What will people say?" "They will say what they always say," Mrs. Winthrop returned. "Whatever hurts most." Dr. Sloane looked sharply at her. "Did you know he was coming, Eleanor?" "No," Mrs. Winthrop said. "If I had, I would hardly have invited him to collapse among my flowers." Lionel gave a short laugh that was not amusement. "He wasn't invited," he said, and then glanced around too quickly. Maud's voice, small as a bird's. Mr. Grange came earlier. I saw him near the books. He asked for Lionel. Lionel wheeled on her. Did he? Well, he didn't find me. Mr. Pike's gaze narrowed, merely attentive. You didn't speak to him at all? Lionel's hand went to his pocket, then away. No. From behind, Mrs. Bicker whispered, Lionel, don't. Sirens did not belong in Little Fordington, but within 20 minutes the growl of a police car approached like an unwelcome animal. Sergeant Weller arrived with 2 constables, his ruddy face set in professional irritation. And he took in the scene, the fete beyond the hedge still absurd with bunting and music, and the body among the bluebells, and exhaled. All right, he said. Everyone back. Doctor, you've checked him. Dr. Sloane gave her estimate and pointed to the mark. Weller crouched, peered, and straightened. Strangulation, he muttered. It's not a fall, Dr. Sloane said. Not if you value your neck. Weller's eyes traveled over the gathered faces. Who found him? Maud answered, not a voice steadier than her hands. I did. I went to fetch napkins from the church hall and saw him through the hedge. Weller nodded, writing. And you, he said, pointing at Lionel. You're Mr. Bicker. You know him? Lionel swallowed. I've met him, professionally. What business would a market-belling solicitor have with you? Lionel's mouth opened, closed. Mrs. Winthrop's gaze was fixed on the ground. Miss Marple's knitting bag felt heavier than it had a moment ago. A constable called out, Sergeant, there's something here. He held up a cream envelope, torn and empty, caught on the hedge where someone had forced through. Weller's eyes sharpened. That, he said, looks very much like an invitation. He turned it over with a thumb. There was no address now, only a torn corner and a faint trace of embossed lettering. Anyone see this before it ended up in the hedge? He demanded. No one answered. Several faces shifted into the blank look of innocence reserved for awkwardness. Lionel's eyes flicked toward his mother. Mrs. Bicker stared at bluebells. Mr. Pike said, It's the sort you were handing out, Mr. Bicker. Cream with a card inside. Lionel's jaw tightened. I gave one envelope to Mrs. Winthrop. Weller's head snapped round. Did you now? And what was the invitation for? Mrs. Winthrop's voice was cool. A private matter. Weller grunted. Private matters have a habit of turning public when someone's dead. Sergeant Weller's gaze lingered on Mrs. de Winthrop until even her composure seemed to acquire a faint crackle. Well? He prompted. She drew herself up. Mr. Bicker delivered an invitation to dine at the Manor House tomorrow evening, a small gathering. I'd not yet decided whether to accept. Lionel gave a short, incredulous breath. Eleanor, that isn't... She turned her head a fraction. It is sufficient. Weller's eyes moved between them. And Mr. Grange? Was he invited to this dinner? Certainly not, Mrs. Winthrop said. Lionel's color rose. I had no reason to invite him anywhere. Maud, pale but resolute, spoke again. He seemed insistent when he asked for Mr. Bicker. In what way? Weller asked. He said it was urgent, that it concerned a document. She swallowed. And that someone would regret delay. A murmur rippled outward. Miss Marple, standing slightly apart, observed how quickly the word document sharpened interest. Papers in villages were more dangerous than pistols. They held mortgages, wills, and the promises made in ink that did not fade with apology. Weller scribbled. And you're certain you didn't speak to him, Mr. Bicker? I've told you, Lionel snapped. I didn't see him. You were here the entire time? Lionel hesitated. I stepped inside the rectory for a moment to wash my hands. Dr. Sloane's brows lifted. You didn't mention that. I didn't think it relevant. Everything is relevant, Weller said flatly. Mr. Pike cleared his throat. Sergeant, and if I may, when I arrived at the drinks table, perhaps 20 minutes before the body was found, I noticed Mr. Grange near the hedge. He appeared to be reading something. A card, perhaps. He looked surprised. Surprised how? Weller demanded. As though he had discovered an error, or a threat. Lionel let out a brittle laugh. That's fanciful. Is it? Pike's tone remained mild. He crumpled the paper slightly before putting it into his pocket. Weller turned to the constable with the torn envelope. Search the body again. The constable obeyed, careful now. From an inner pocket he produced a folded card, creased sharply down the middle. Weller opened it. His ruddy face darkened. Well, he said slowly, this doesn't read like a dinner invitation. He did not read it aloud at once. Instead, he looked up. Mrs. Winthrop, you say your card was an invitation to dine? It was. And this? He held up the card. This reads, you are requested to attend the reading of a certain matter, long deferred. Sunday, 3 o'clock, the churchyard. Silence fell, thicker than before. The churchyard, Weller repeated. That's where he's lying. Lionel's jaw worked. I don't know anything about that. Miss Marple felt, rather than saw, the tightening of Mrs. Bicker's grip on Maud's arm. Weller continued. It's unsigned, but embossed at the top. He squinted. L.B. All eyes went to Lionel. That could mean anything, Lionel said quickly. There are dozens of LBS in England. Not so many in Little Fordington, Weller replied. Mrs. Winthrop spoke, each word clipped. The envelope I received bore the same embossing. Lionel turned on her. You said it was merely dinner. I said it was sufficient, she returned. I did not say it was truthful. Weller's gaze sharpened again. Then what did your card say? Mrs. Winthrop hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty shadowed her. It mentioned a reading of a will. The word struck like a dropped tray. Even the birds seemed to pause. A will, Weller echoed. Yes. It stated that certain misunderstandings would be corrected, that I should attend to hear the truth. And you thought that merited no comment? He asked. I thought it a tasteless joke, she said. Or an attempt at intimidation. Intimidation from whom? Her eyes flicked almost imperceptibly toward Lionel. I cannot imagine. Miss Marple considered the exchange with quiet absorption. In her experience, wills did not materialize in churchyards without reason. Nor did solicitors travel unannounced to rural fetes unless summoned by urgency or fear. Sergeant, Dr. Sloane said briskly, if Mr. Grange was lured here under false pretenses, so then whoever wrote that card wished him to be in that precise spot at that precise time. 3 o'clock, Pike added. We found him just after. Weller nodded. So we have a meeting arranged, a solicitor expecting a reading, and instead he's strangled. He looked squarely at Lionel. Did you stand to gain from any will, Mr. Bicker? Lionel's lips thinned. My father left everything to my mother. That's common knowledge. And Mr. Grange handled the estate. Weller pressed. Yes. And was there a dispute? Lionel's silence lengthened. Mrs. Bicker found her voice at last, trembling. There were questions, she said, about a codicil. Weller's pen paused. What sort of questions? Whether it existed, she whispered. Miss Marple's needles had stilled entirely. A codicil, an addition often secret, often inconvenient. She thought of Lionel's smile as he handed Mrs. Winthrop her envelope, and of the faint urgency in his wrist. Where is this codicil now? Weller asked. Mrs. Bicker shook her head. Mr. Grange said he would clarify matters today. In the churchyard. Weller's tone dripped skepticism. He said the truth ought to stand among the dead, she murmured. A breeze stirred the bluebells, setting them nodding gently around the still figure of Felix Grange. Weller straightened. Until we sort this out, no one leaves the village without informing me. Mr. Bicker, I'll need a full statement. Mrs. Winthrop, you as well. And you, Mr. Pike. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, though she did not look at it. The torn envelope in the hedge, the card in her bag, the duplicated invitations, one promising dinner, another promising revelation, formed a pattern delicate as lace. Someone had arranged a meeting among graves to expose a secret about the dead, and someone else had ensured the only man who could speak of it would never do so. The fete did not so much end as unravel. Bunting fluttered above abandoned teacups. Jam tarts sagged in the sun. Sergeant Weller stationed a constable at the churchyard gate and shepherded the most excitable villagers back toward the rectory lawn. Statements were taken in clusters, voices low and brittle. The body remained where it had fallen, now discreetly screened from view by a hastily fetched tarpaulin. Miss Marple sat once more in her wicker chair, her knitting demurely advanced by several inches. She had not yet examined the small card in her bag, and one did not pounce upon a clue. One waited until it revealed how it wished to be understood. Lionel stood near the drinks table, speaking sharply to his mother. "You shouldn't have mentioned the codicil," he hissed. "I will not lie," Mrs. Bicker replied, though her voice trembled. "Not about your father." "It was nothing," Lionel insisted. "A rumor. Grange enjoyed drama." "Grange enjoyed precision," came Mrs. Winthrop's cool voice as she approached. "Anti-drama was left to others." Lionel's smile returned, but it sat ill now, like a coat borrowed in haste. "Eleanor, surely you don't imagine I strangled a solicitor in broad daylight?" "I imagine," she said evenly, "that men who smile too easily often hope not to be questioned." Dr. Sloane, hovering within earshot, intervened. "Let us not conduct the trial on the lawn." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Mr. Dorian Pike, who stood slightly apart, and observing with the calm interest of a man accustomed to conflict. He caught Miss Marple's glance and inclined his head faintly, as though acknowledging a fellow spectator. In due course, Weller approached the trio. "Mr. Bicker, you said you stepped into the rectory. How long were you absent?" 5 minutes, 10 at most." "Did anyone see you?" Lionel hesitated. "No." Weller's pen scratched. "Convenient." Mrs. Bicker clutched her handbag. Lionel was with me for most of the afternoon." "Most?" Weller echoed. "But not all." He turned to Mrs. Winthrop. "You received a card mentioning a will. Do you still have it?" She stiffened. "It is in my reticule." "May I?" She produced it with reluctance. Weller read silently, then compared it with the card taken from Grange's pocket. His brow furrowed. "These are not identical," he said. "Same embossing. Similar phrasing, but yours mentions a private consultation after the reading. His does not." Mrs. Winthrop's lips pressed thin. "Then someone tailored them. For what purpose?" "To ensure attendance," Mr. Pike suggested quietly. Weller looked at him sharply. "And you are?" "Dorian Pike, temporarily at the gatehouse." "Occupation?" "Insurance assessment." Weller made a note, though his eyes lingered thoughtfully. Miss Marple rose and drifted nearer, as though drawn by idle curiosity. "How confusing invitations can be," she murmured. "One expects tea, and finds tragedy instead." Weller gave her a polite nod. He had long ago learned that Miss Marple's mild remarks were rarely without direction. "Confusing indeed, miss." "It is the duplication that interests me," she continued. "2 cards, 2 slightly different promises. It suggests anticipation of resistance." "Resistance from whom?" Weller asked. "From those who prefer the past undisturbed," she said softly. Lionel laughed abruptly. "Are we to indict the entire village now?" "No," Miss Marple replied gently. "Only those who had something to lose." A constable approached with a small notebook recovered from Granger's coat. "Sergeant, there's an entry for today. 3 p.m., Little Fordington. Final confirmation, Codicil, Bicker Estate." Mrs. Bicker swayed. Dr. Sloane caught her arm. Weller's voice hardened. "Mr. Bicker, it seems Mr. Grange intended to confirm something about your father's will. Something final." Lionel's gaze darted toward the churchyard. Then perhaps someone else feared what he would say. "Who?" Weller demanded. Lionel spread his hands. "My mother would not benefit from scandal. Mrs. Winthrop has no claim. As for Mr. Pike, he's a stranger." Pike's expression did not alter. "Strangers seldom inherit." "Not always," Mrs. Winthrop said softly. A faint silence followed that remark. Miss Marple felt the pattern tighten another thread. Weller cleared his throat. "Until I know more, I advise discretion. This concerns a potential alteration to an estate. If there is a codicil, I want it located." "It was never produced," Mrs. Bicker whispered. "Grange said he would bring proof." "Proof is now lying in the churchyard," Weller said grimly. The afternoon waned. Villagers dispersed in subdued knots, their earlier gaiety replaced by furtive speculation. The rectory lawn, so recently cheerful, felt like a stage after the curtain had fallen. Props abandoned, and applause replaced by whispers. Miss Marple walked slowly homeward, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. At the bend in the lane she paused, ensuring she was alone. Then she withdrew the small rectangle of cards she had collected from the path. It bore only a fragment of text, torn at the top and bottom. Yet the paper matched the others, cream, thick, faintly embossed. On the visible line were the words, "Must be set right before sunset." Miss Marple considered that quietly. Before sunset. Not merely a reading, then, but an urgency bound to time. She replaced the fragment carefully. In her experience, men who arranged revelations in churchyards did so when ordinary rooms would not serve. The dead were excellent witnesses. They contradicted no one. Behind her, the church bell began to toll the hour, slow, measured, indifferent. Little Fordington had been invited to a reading among graves. Instead, it had been given a death. And somewhere within the polite faces and careful smiles of the village, someone was already calculating whether the silence of Felix Grange would prove sufficient, or whether another voice must be stilled before the sun went down. The church bell's final note seemed to linger in the air long after it had ceased, as though reluctant to surrender the afternoon entirely to silence. Miss Marple resumed her slow walk, her thoughts moving with far greater briskness than her steps. Before sunset. And the phrase carried intention. Whoever had arranged the meeting had not meant it to drift into evening gossip. It was to culminate in something decisive. At the corner by the post office, she encountered Mr. Dorian Pike, hat in hand. "Miss Marple," he said courteously. "An unsettling day." "Indeed," she replied. "One does not expect legal clarifications to end in horticultural tragedy." A flicker of amusement crossed his face, then vanished. "You noticed more than most, I think." "An advantage of sitting down," she said mildly. "One is not tempted to hurry." He studied her. "Do you believe Mr. Bicker guilty?" "I believe," Miss Marple answered, "that guilt is often less a matter of strength than of fear. The question is, who feared Mr. Grange's confirmation?" Pike hesitated. Grange was thorough. If he meant to confirm a codicil, he would have had documentation. "Precisely," she said, "and yet none was found. Perhaps it was taken." "Perhaps," she agreed. "Aye, by someone who knew it existed." Pike's gaze sharpened. "You think the killer searched him?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that men do not arrange readings in churchyards without anticipating interruption." He inclined his head slightly. "You are formidable, Miss Marple." She smiled. "Oh, no, merely attentive." They parted, each carrying private considerations. Miss Marple continued home, pausing only once to observe Mrs. Winthrop standing rigid at her gate, staring toward the distant church tower as if calculating shadows. By the time Miss Marple reached her cottage, the sky had shifted toward amber. She settled by her sitting-room window and laid the torn fragment beside the knitting she had not resumed. Must be set right before sunset. The handwriting, she now noticed, was not printed like the embossed cards. It was inked, firm but hurried. A knock at her door interrupted reflection. It was Mrs. Bicker. "I came," she said, twisting her gloves. "But came," she said, twisting her gloves. "But you have known this village longer than anyone." "Come in, my dear," Miss Marple said. "Tea is a remedy for most confusions." Mrs. Bicker sank into a chair. "Lionel is not a violent man," she began at once. "Ambitious, perhaps, restless, but not violent." "Violence," Miss Marple observed, pouring tea. "This is sometimes the last refuge of the cornered." Mrs. Bicker's eyes filled. "There was a codicil. My husband drafted it a week before he died. He intended to amend the estate." "In what way?" She swallowed. "He meant to divide a portion, not solely to Lionel." "To whom, then?" A tremor crossed her face. "To a child, a boy." Miss Marple did not start. "Whose child?" "I do not know," Mrs. Bicker whispered. "He would not say, only that he had a responsibility, that it must be acknowledged before it was too late." "And Mr. Grange knew of this?" "He drafted it, but after my husband's death, he claimed the document was mislaid. Then he hinted it might yet surface." "And today?" Miss Marple prompted softly. "He telephoned this morning," Mrs. Bicker said. "He said matters would be clarified publicly. That concealment had gone on long enough." "In the churchyard," Miss Marple murmured. "Sir, yes." "Did Lionel know of the child?" "I told him only that his father had considered alterations." She closed her eyes. "Lionel was furious. He said Grange was manipulating me." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And was he?" Mrs. Bicker hesitated. "Grange enjoyed leverage, but he was not reckless." A shadow crossed the window as someone passed outside. Both women glanced up instinctively. The day was narrowing. Sunset approached with quiet inevitability. "Did your husband ever meet this child?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes, once, years ago." "And you?" Mrs. Bicker shook her head. Miss Marple considered the pattern anew. A hidden child, a codicil, a solicitor threatening revelation before sunset, and invitations distributed strategically to those most affected. "Mrs. Winthrop," she said slowly, "did your husband have any association with her family?" Mrs. Bicker stiffened. "That is absurd." "Absurd it is," Miss Marple said gently. "None are often masks." Before Mrs. Bicker could reply, another knock sounded, firmer this time. Sergeant Weller stood outside. "Apologies, Miss Marple," he said. "I'm making further inquiries." "Mrs. Bicker, I was just coming to see you." Mrs. Bicker rose shakily. "Of course." Weller's gaze moved between them. "We've examined Mr. Grange's motor car. No documents pertaining to the Bicker estate. However, there was a railway receipt, dated yesterday, from London." "London?" Mrs. Bicker echoed. "Yes." And a note, torn, from someone signing only with an initial. "P. It states, if you intend to expose this, be certain of your evidence." Miss Marple felt a faint tightening within her chest. "P," she repeated softly. Weller nodded. "Mr. Pike is the only P presently lodging in the village." Outside, the sky burned briefly, brilliantly, before surrendering to dusk. Sunset had arrived, punctual and indifferent. And somewhere between the promise to set matters right and the falling of light, one seemed to settle heavily in the small sitting room. Mrs. Bicker stared at him as though he had spoken in a foreign tongue. "Mr. Pike," she repeated faintly. "That is impossible. He arrived only weeks ago." Weller gave a non-committal grunt. "Strangers arrive with histories, sometimes inconvenient ones." Miss Marple observed the sergeant's expression with quiet interest. He was not yet convinced, but he was grateful for a direction. A single initial was something solid in a case that had thus far felt like lace pulled too tight. "The note was unsigned beyond the initial?" she asked gently. "Yes, merely P. No address." Folded into Grange's notebook. "And the railway receipt was from London yesterday," she mused. "So, Mr. Grange met someone before coming here." "Likely," Weller said. "And if that someone warned him, perhaps they feared what he intended to disclose." Mrs. Bicker rose unsteadily. "You cannot believe Mr. Pike murdered him. He barely knew us." Weller shrugged. "Motive first, acquaintance second. I'll be speaking to him presently." When they had gone, Miss Marple remained by the window, watching the last trace of daylight dissolve. Mr. Pike. She recalled his attentive stillness at the fete, of the measured tone with which he had described Grange reading the card. He had not appeared startled by death, only thoughtful. The following morning dawned pale and uncertain, as if the village itself were reluctant to resume its habits. News had spread with the efficiency of wind through hedges. Curtains twitched, voices lowered. Miss Marple made her way toward the gatehouse shortly after breakfast. The path wound past the churchyard, where the bluebells still nodded innocently, as though unaware they had sheltered violence. A faint indentation in the earth marked where the body had lain. She paused briefly, noting the proximity to the Bicker family plot. That detail had not been accidental. Mr. Pike opened the gatehouse door before she knocked. "I thought you might come," he said. "One dislikes unanswered questions," she replied mildly. "They multiply." He ushered her into a modest sitting room, tidy to the point of austerity. No personal photographs adorned the mantel. A suitcase, half-packed, stood discreetly near the stairs. "You intend to leave?" she asked. "I had planned to," he said evenly. "Now I suspect I shall be prevented." Sergeant Weller found a note in Mr. Grange's possession, signed P. "I assumed as much." Miss Marple lifted her brows. "You are admirably composed." "There is little advantage in fluster," he replied. "Did you write it?" "Yes." The admission hung between them without flourish. "That you warned him not to expose something without certainty," she prompted. "I did." "Why?" He walked to the window, looking toward the church tower. "Because he was wrong." "In what respect?" "He believed the codicil existed in enforceable form. It did not." Miss Marple's knitting needles, which she had brought almost unconsciously, rested motionless in her lap. "You speak with authority." "I drafted it," he said quietly. She regarded him with renewed attention. "You are not an insurance assessor." "No." "Then who are you, Mr. Pike?" "My name is Peter Grange." The simplicity of it struck with greater force than drama would have managed. "Felix Grange was your father." Silence settled, not uncomfortable but dense with implication. "He asked you to come?" Miss Marple said at last. "Yes. He discovered the truth of the codicil years after it was drafted. He believed it had been intentionally suppressed." "By whom?" Peter's jaw tightened. "By Lionel Bicker." Miss Marple considered that calmly. "And the child named in the codicil?" "Myself." Outside, a rook called sharply from the yew tree. "My father persuaded Mr. Bicker Sr. to acknowledge me," Peter continued. "Not publicly, but legally. The codicil provided for a modest trust. After Mr. Bicker died, Lionel insisted no such document existed. And your father allowed this. He searched, he confronted, he delayed." Bitterness edged his tone. But he enjoyed leverage. As your friend Mrs. Bicker hinted, he preferred control to conclusion. And yesterday? He told me he would end it, that he would confront Lionel before witnesses. He believed Lionel would produce the original to avoid scandal. Miss Marple shook her head faintly. Men who fear scandal do not often yield so conveniently. I warned him, Peter said. I told him not to provoke without evidence. I wrote that note after meeting him in London, and he insisted upon proceeding. Did you meet him again here? Yes, briefly. Before the fete. Her gaze sharpened. At what hour? 2:30. By the churchyard. And what passed between you? He showed me a copy of the codicil, not the original. He claimed the original was secured. Peter's mouth hardened. He intended to announce its existence publicly at 3. Among the graves, she murmured. He said it was symbolic. Symbolism, Miss Marple observed. Can be dangerous. A knock sounded abruptly at the door. Sergeant Weller entered without ceremony. Mr. Pike, he said, eyes narrowing slightly. Or should I say Mr. Grange? Peter did not flinch. You may say either. Weller's gaze flicked to Miss Marple. You knew? I suspected, she replied gently. Weller folded his arms. Your father met you yesterday. That much we've confirmed from a witness near the lane. You had opportunity. I did, Peter said. But I did not kill him. Can you account for your whereabouts at 3 o'clock? Peter hesitated, only a fraction. Weller's eyes sharpened. Well? I was in the churchyard, Peter said slowly, waiting for him to begin. And did he? No. Someone reached him first. The room seemed suddenly smaller. Who? Weller demanded. Peter met his gaze steadily. Lionel Bicker. Sergeant Weller's expression did not alter, but something in his stance sharpened. You saw Mr. Bicker approach your father? He asked. Yes. From where? Behind the yew, Peter replied. I did not wish to be seen. My father intended the announcement to force acknowledgement. I was not meant to appear unless necessary. And you expect me to believe you remained hidden while your father was killed? Peter's jaw tightened. I did not see the act itself. I heard raised voices. I stepped forward only after Lionel had gone. Miss Marple watched him closely. His tone held anger. With him. Lionel replied. It was buried with him. Lionel replied, it was buried long ago. Then there was a struggle. I thought. He stopped. You thought? Weller pressed. That it was bluster. They had argued before. And when you stepped forward? My father was on the ground. Alive? Peter closed his eyes briefly. No. Weller paced once across the small room. Why not cry out? Why not summon help at once? Because, Peter said bitterly, I realized that whoever had suppressed the codicil might have taken it from him. I searched his coat. Miss Marple's needles resumed their faint clicking. And found nothing. Weller's gaze was steady. So you admit tampering with the body. I admit searching for what was already stolen. And then, I returned to the fete. I intended to confront Lionel publicly, but the scream came before I could. Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward the half-packed suitcase again. And yet you plan to leave. Peter did not deny it. My presence complicates matters. I have no desire to become the village scandal. Scandal, Miss Marple murmured, is rarely optional. Weller stopped pacing. If you saw Lionel leave your father, why say nothing sooner? Peter met his gaze without flinching. Because I cannot prove what I did not see. And because accusing him without the document would achieve nothing. Miss Marple considered the sequence carefully. Lionel absent briefly. Grange determined to reveal a codicil. Peter hidden among graves. A confrontation overheard but not witnessed, and no original document recovered. "Sergeant," she said mildly, "may I inquire whether Mr. Granger's pockets were thoroughly examined before the body was removed?" "Of course," Weller replied. "Nothing but the notebook, the cards, and his wallet. And no loose papers nearby?" "None," Miss Marple nodded. "It is curious. If Mr. Grange intended a public revelation, he would not rely solely on memory. Unless," Weller said slowly, "he meant merely to threaten disclosure." Peter shook his head. He was finished with threats. A thought seemed to strike Miss Marple. Mr. Grange said the original was secured. Did he specify where? Peter hesitated. He implied it was in safekeeping, that if anything happened to him, so it would surface. Weller snorted softly. "Convenient." "Perhaps not," Miss Marple said. "Men who enjoy leverage rarely relinquish it entirely." A constable appeared at the door, breathless. "Sergeant, we've had a report. Mrs. Winthrop has been taken ill." All three turned. "Ill?" Weller repeated. "At the manor house. Collapsed shortly after breakfast. Dr. Sloane's there." Miss Marple rose at once. Then we must not keep her waiting." The manor house sat in dignified isolation beyond clipped hedges and the old stone walls. When they arrived, Dr. Sloane met them in the hall, her expression grave. "She's conscious," the doctor said, "but shaken." "What happened?" Weller demanded. "She received a note," Dr. Sloane replied. "Delivered by hand." "In what manner?" "Left upon her writing desk. No envelope." Miss Marple's pulse quickened slightly. "And the content?" "Doctor," as Sloane handed the paper to Weller. He read aloud. "The truth has already been buried. Attend to your own secrets." Peter inhaled sharply. "Buried," he echoed. Miss Marple took the note gently. The paper matched the earlier fragment she had found. The handwriting was firm, hurried. "Before sunset," she murmured. Weller looked up. "What?" "Nothing," she said softly. They entered Mrs. Winthrop's sitting room. She reclined upon a chaise, pale but composed. "I will not be intimidated," she said before anyone spoke. "Whoever wrote that fears exposure." "Exposure of what?" Weller asked. Her gaze shifted briefly toward Peter. Miss Marple observed the glance with delicate precision. Secrets, she reflected, rarely traveled alone. If a codicil acknowledged one hidden child, it might threaten other reputations as well. Outside, clouds gathered with quiet intent, dimming the late morning light. The village had expected a reading among graves. Instead, it found itself entangled in warnings and half-spoken histories. And as Miss Marple folded the anonymous note carefully, she felt the pattern nearing completion, not through force, but through the simple, relentless observation of who flinched when the word "buried" was spoken aloud. Miss Marple did not immediately return the note to Sergeant Weller. Instead, she allowed her eyes to travel once more over the hurried strokes of ink. "The same hand," she said quietly. "High as the fragment I found near the path yesterday." Weller's head snapped toward her. "Fragment." She produced it from her reticule with unhurried composure. "Must be set right before sunset." It lay on the churchyard path, some distance from where Mr. Grange fell. Peter leaned forward. "You did not mention this." "One prefers to understand a piece before placing it among others," she replied gently. Weller compared the two slips. Identical paper, identical ink. So whoever wrote this warning also wrote the earlier instruction? "Which suggests," Miss Marple continued, "that Mr. Grange received more than one communication. One urging urgency, another threatening silence." Mrs. Winthrop stirred faintly on the chaise. "You think I wrote it?" she said, her voice thin but steady. "I think," Miss Marple answered, "that you recognized the word 'buried' before Sergeant Weller read it aloud." A silence followed, not accusatory, but expectant. Mrs. Winthrop's composure wavered. "My late husband," she said at last, Had business dealings with Mr. Bicker Sr. Investments. Discreet ones. Discreet in what way? Weller asked. In that they were not universally admired, she replied. If a codicil existed acknowledging an illegitimate child, it would not be the only embarrassment. Peter's eyes darkened. You imply my existence threatens you. I imply, she returned coolly, that revelations rarely confine themselves to one name. Miss Marple nodded slightly. Quite so. Secrets are seldom solitary. Weller folded his arms. Mrs. Winthrop, did you know of Mr. Grange's intention before yesterday? I suspected, she admitted. He hinted, months ago, that something long suppressed might re-emerge. And did you attempt to prevent it? No. Miss Marple watched her closely. The denial lacked the faint, defensive stiffness she had observed in others. Instead, there was fatigue. Did you meet Mr. Grange yesterday before the fete? She asked. Mrs. Winthrop hesitated only briefly. Yes. Weller stiffened. When? At 1:30. He called upon me. He wished to ensure my attendance at the reading. And what passed between you? He warned me that the codicil would implicate more than one household. Her gaze flicked toward Peter again. He advised me to prepare. Prepare for what? Weller demanded. For truth. The words settled uneasily in the room. Miss Marple spoke gently. And did you? Mrs. Winthrop's lips curved faintly. One cannot prepare for disgrace, Miss Marple. One endures it. Peter stepped back, absorbing the implication. Then you knew. I suspected, she repeated. Suspected what? Weller pressed. That the child named in the codicil was not merely an abstract responsibility, that he lived. Peter's voice was quiet. And that I was here. Yes. Silence stretched. Miss Marple's gaze moved thoughtfully from face to face. If Mr. Grange met Mrs. Winthrop at 1:30 and Mr. Peter Grange at 2:30, then the only remaining interval is shortly before 3. Lionel, Weller said. Possibly, Miss Marple agreed. But we must be careful not to assume sequence equates to guilt. Peter exhaled sharply. I heard Lionel threaten him. You heard anger, Miss Marple corrected. Anger is not always lethal. Weller frowned. Are you suggesting another party intervened? I am suggesting, she replied, that whoever wrote these notes anticipated exposure before sunset. The urgency implies a deadline known beyond a single confrontation. Meaning? Weller asked. Meaning that the codicil's existence may already have been discovered by someone other than Lionel. A servant entered quietly, whispering to Dr. Sloane. The doctor turned toward them. Lionel Bicker has requested to see Mrs. Winthrop, she said. Weller's eyes narrowed. He can wait. Mrs. Winthrop raised herself upright. No, let him come. Moments later, Lionel entered, pale but composed. His smile, once effortless, now felt deliberate. I hear you've been unwell, Eleanor, he said softly. I hear you've been accused, she replied. His gaze shifted to Peter. And I see we've all decided to abandon discretion. Peter held his stare. You confronted my father. Yes, Lionel said evenly. He was attempting blackmail. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. In what manner? He claimed a codicil existed awarding half my inheritance to a stranger. He demanded acknowledgement in public. And did you believe him? Weller asked. I believed he enjoyed drama, Lionel replied. I refused to indulge it. Peter's hands clenched. You called it buried. Lionel's expression flickered. Old grievances often are. Miss Marple's eyes rested on him thoughtfully. You left him alive. Yes. And you did not search him. No. The denial came swiftly, too swiftly. Weller stepped forward. Mr. Bicker, if you took that document, I did not, Lionel snapped. Miss Marple's voice remained soft. Then someone else must have, for the original has not surfaced, and yet someone writes of burial and secrecy. Lionel's smile faltered, just perceptibly. Outside, thunder murmured in the distance. The storm that had threatened since morning began to gather weight, pressing upon the manor house windows. Miss Marple folded her hands. The pattern was nearly complete now, not through confession, but through reaction. One word, one glance, one hesitation at precisely the wrong moment. And as the first low roll of thunder deepened, she understood that the truth had never been in the codicil itself, but in who feared its reading more than its existence. The thunder did not break at once. It rolled distantly, as though the sky itself were deliberating. Up in the strained quiet of Mrs. Winthrop's sitting room, Miss Marple regarded Lionel Bicker with the same mild attention she might have given a slightly crooked hem. "You say," she began gently, "that Mr. Grange attempted blackmail. Yet you attended the fete with invitations prepared, invitations embossed with your initials." Lionel's jaw tightened. "I host dinners. That is hardly a crime." "Indeed not," she agreed. "But these invitations were not uniform. One promised dinner, and another promised a reading in the churchyard." Weller's gaze sharpened. "You had both printed?" "I had nothing of the sort," Lionel retorted. "If Grange forged something, that is not my responsibility." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And yet the wording must be set right before sunset suggests urgency on your part, not his." Peter stepped forward. "My father would never have written that. He relished postponement." Lionel laughed, brittle and thin. "You seem very certain of your father's habits." "I am." Miss Marple watched the exchange carefully. Lionel's agitation was no longer controlled. It flickered beneath his skin like trapped light. "Mr. Bicker," she said, "when you confronted Mr. Grange, what precisely did you say?" "I told him," Lionel replied tightly, "that dragging up the past would benefit no one." And he answered, "That truth would benefit someone." "Ah." Miss Marple's eyes softened almost sympathetically. "And that frightened you?" "Do not be absurd," Lionel snapped. "On the contrary," she murmured. "Fear explains much." Weller stepped closer. "If you feared exposure, you had motive." "I left him alive," Lionel insisted. "Alive but angry," Peter said. "And alone with you." The storm cracked at last, a sudden burst of rain striking the windows. Miss Marple did not flinch. "It was not the existence of the codicil that threatened you, Mr. Bicker," she said quietly. "It was its audience." Lionel stared at her. "If Mr. Grange had merely informed you privately, you might have negotiated. But he intended a public reading before witnesses, including Mrs. Winthrop." Mrs. Winthrop's gaze sharpened faintly. "Why should that matter?" Weller demanded. "Because," Miss Marple continued, "Mrs. Winthrop's late husband invested heavily with Mr. Bicker Sr., investments that required discretion. If an illegitimate child were publicly acknowledged, questions would follow, questions about timing, about money diverted quietly." Mrs. Winthrop's hands tightened upon the chaise. Lionel's voice dropped. "Speculation?" "Not entirely," Miss Marple said. "Mr. Grange met Mrs. Winthrop at 1:30. He warned her. She did not write the notes. Her hand is steadier. Nor did Peter. His script differs. That leaves the author someone who wished to control the narrative." Weller's eyes moved to Lionel. "The fragment I found," Miss Marple went on, "Nas was torn in haste, likely during a struggle. Mr. Grange held it when confronted." Peter nodded slowly. "He showed me a copy of the codicil. Not the original." "Precisely," Miss Marple said. "He intended to produce the original at 3. But when you confronted him, Mr. Bicker, you realized he might truly possess it?" Lionel's composure cracked. "He had nothing." "But you could not be certain," she replied. "And if he announced its existence publicly, even without presenting it, Suspicion would ignite. Mrs. Winthrop would demand records. Others would question accounts. Mrs. Winthrop's voice was icy. Indeed. Lionel's breathing quickened. You told him it was buried long ago, Peter said quietly. Yes, Lionel snapped, because it was. Buried, Miss Marple repeated softly. An interesting word. Thunder rolled again. Your father, she continued, drafted the codicil. Mr. Grange prepared it. But after your father's death, Lionel shot back. By denying another's, Lionel shot back. By denying another's existence. By preventing scandal. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. And yesterday, when Mr. Grange insisted on public acknowledgement, you feared he possessed proof. I had to know, Lionel muttered. So you demanded to see it. He refused. And in the struggle, she said softly, you seized his papers. Weller leaned forward. And when he resisted? Lionel's hands trembled. Rain lashed harder against the glass. I did not mean, he began, then stopped. Silence engulfed the room. Miss Marple spoke almost kindly. You meant only to silence him, just long enough. But anger is clumsy. Peter's face had gone ashen. Weller's voice was firm now. Mr. Bicker. Lionel looked from one face to another, his charm utterly spent. He would have ruined us all, he whispered. And so you ensured he spoke no more, Miss Marple said. The words settled with quiet finality. Weller stepped forward, placing a steady hand upon Lionel's arm. I'm arresting you for the murder of Felix Grange. Lionel did not resist. The fight had gone out of him as completely as the day's light had gone from the sky. As the door closed behind them and the storm continued its measured descent, Miss Marple remained standing for a moment. It was never about inheritance, she said softly to Peter. It was about exposure. Your father chose a stage of graves. Mr. Bicker chose silence. Peter swallowed. And the codicil? Even destroyed documents, Miss Marple replied, leave shadows, and shadows, when examined patiently, tell their own truths. Outside, the rain began to ease. Little Fordington would resume its habits in time, though not without the memory of a smile that had concealed far more than an invitation. The Miss Marple folded her hands once more, reflecting, as she so often did, that human nature was rarely surprising. Only the lengths to which it would go to protect its own carefully tended image. The storm passed as quickly as it had gathered, leaving Little Fordington washed and subdued. By the following afternoon, the sky had cleared into a pale, almost embarrassed blue, as though the village preferred not to dwell upon the previous day's exposure. Felix Grange had been taken away. A Lionel Bicker sat in a cell in Market Belling, no longer the prodigal son returned in polished motor cars, but a man stripped of charm and certainty. Yet for Miss Marple, the matter did not feel entirely complete. It was Mrs. Winthrop who suggested they gather, quietly, discreetly, at the manor house. Present were Sergeant Weller, Peter Grange, Mrs. Bicker, Dr. Sloane, and Miss Marple herself. The room held none of the earlier hysteria. Instead, there was a wary calm. I like the hush after a quarrel when truth has been spoken but not yet absorbed. Sergeant Weller cleared his throat. Mr. Bicker has confessed to struggling with Mr. Grange. He maintains he did not intend to kill him. Claims it was panic. Panic, Miss Marple repeated gently, is a powerful accelerant. Peter stood near the mantel, his posture rigid but composed. He destroyed the original codicil years ago, he said. My father suspected but lacked proof. Mrs. Bicker's face was lined with grief rather than surprise. Lionel always believed he was protecting us, she murmured. He could not bear the thought of scandal. Miss Marple regarded her kindly. Protection, when rooted in pride, often resembles possession. Weller consulted his notes. We've searched Mr. Bicker's study. In the fireplace we found remnants of older legal papers. Not enough to reconstruct, but enough to confirm destruction. Peter exhaled slowly. Then there was never a chance. Oh, there was always a chance, Miss Marple said. Just not the one your father imagined. All eyes turned to her. The codicil, she continued, was less significant than the fear surrounding it. Mr. Grange believed public confrontation would force confession. He underestimated the depth of Lionel's desperation. Peter's voice was quiet. He thought shame would compel honesty. Shame, Miss Marple replied, more often compels concealment. Doctor, to his own anxiety. He hoped to frighten his own anxiety. He hoped to frighten Mr. Grange into retreat, or perhaps to arrange the meeting on ground he believed symbolically advantageous. The churchyard, Mrs. Winthrop murmured. Yes, Miss Marple said, among graves where past sins are meant to rest undisturbed. It was Lionel who chose that stage, not your father, Peter. Peter looked startled. But my father intended a reading, certainly. But the phrasing of urgency, the insistence on sunset, those belonged to a man afraid of losing control. Weller nodded slowly. His handwriting matches the fragments. Mrs. Bicker closed her eyes. He always feared losing what he believed was his. And yet, Miss Marple said softly, inheritance is rarely absolute. It carries obligations as well as privilege. A quiet settled over the room. Mrs. Winthrop spoke at last. No, there is another matter. Miss Marple inclined her head. My late husband's investments, Mrs. Winthrop continued. If scrutiny follows this case, they will surface. Then better they surface honestly, Miss Marple said gently. Secrets do not improve with age. Peter turned toward Mrs. Bicker. I never wished to disgrace your family. You did not, she replied faintly. We disgraced ourselves by denying you. Miss Marple watched the exchange with a faint, approving softness. Now the tragedy lay not in the existence of a hidden child, nor even in a destroyed document, but in the long refusal to acknowledge truth when it might still have been spoken without violence. Sergeant Weller closed his notebook. The Crown will decide the charge, but with confession and evidence, the matter is straightforward. Few matters are truly straightforward, Miss Marple observed. Only the motives behind them. Peter approached her. You knew before he confessed. I knew, she corrected gently, that he feared exposure more than he valued denial. His smile at the fate, so carefully arranged, tightened each time the word buried was uttered. A man may destroy a paper, but he cannot so easily erase his reaction to its mention. Peter managed a faint, rueful smile. You saw what others missed. I saw, she said, what human nature has shown me many times before. Outside, the village resumed its ordinary rhythm. Children's voices drifted faintly from the lane. A gardener clipped hedges with methodical care. Life in Little Fordington possessed a remarkable capacity for restoration. As the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple remained by the window a moment longer. The churchyard lay visible in the distance, its stones upright and silent beneath the clear sky. The bluebells had righted themselves after the storm. Dr. Sloane approached quietly. It will be talked about for years. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. But eventually as a cautionary tale rather than a scandal. And what is the caution? The doctor asked. Miss Marple smiled faintly. That a smile may conceal many things. Resentment, fear, even love misplaced. But it cannot conceal the truth forever, particularly not when the truth insists upon being read. She picked up her knitting, the steady rhythm of the needles restoring order to her thoughts. Human beings, she reflected, were endlessly consistent in their frailties. Pride begot secrecy. Secrecy invited fear. Fear, when cornered, turned deadly. And yet, even amid graves and ruined reputations, acknowledgement could still offer a quieter form of justice. Beyond the window, sunlight settled gently over Little Fordington, as though nothing had ever disturbed its peace. But Miss Marple knew better. Peace, like truth, was not the absence of darkness. It was the willingness to face what lay hidden and allow it, finally, to be named.